Welcome back to these series of lectures. This is History 1122, the second half of Western civilization. The last time we were here, I tried to make the connection between the Mongol Empire, the Venetian merchant and explorer Marco Polo, and Christopher Columbus. We talked about the great significance of the Mongol empires, not so much that their military prowess, although that is impressive, but the fact that the Mongols were able to unify large portions of Eurasia, the creation of this elaborate horse trail system with its stations and its passports allows for safe travel for missionaries and merchants and others. And of course, the most famous European who took advantage of the Mongol system was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. I mentioned his book, and it has more than one title. Let's face it, the book was published, in the late 13th century or so, maybe early 14th century. The Description of the World. Polo claims to have lived and worked for the great Khan. This, of course, is Kublai Khan, whom we talked about last time. Kublai Khan is the Mongol ruler over the Wan Dynasty in China. Kublai Khan, of course, the grandson of the infamous Genghis Khan. Now, I read a book some years ago. I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head. If you're interested, I can look it up and find it for you. And the author made the argument that there's evidence that perhaps Polo exaggerated his travels, that perhaps he actually did not go to China. I'm going to just take a few minutes and talk about this because it's interesting and it tends to complicate our view of Columbus and the founding of the Western Hemisphere, at least by the Europeans. I read Polo's book many years ago. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I used to keep it on my bedstand. And if I had insomnia, I'd pick it up and open to whatever page and begin to read. And within a few minutes, I'd be asleep. There are parts of Polo's book that are interesting. His discussion of the Great Khan and the court there in Beijing or Peking. The falcon hunts and the harems and all this stuff is interesting. But Polo goes on and on and on about trade items and sort of a descriptive landscapes. And a lot of the book is tiresome. But at any rate, after reading Polo's book, I read this other scholarly work that made the argument that Polo may not have gone to China. So I want to talk about some of the things that Polo omitted from his book. Now remember, Polo had returned to Italy, and he'd gotten involved in sort of civil wars between the Italian city-states. And I believe he was taken POW and landed in jail. And it was in jail that he met a writer, and they began to put together what we now call the Description of the World. What was left out? Now, if you're an Italian or European like Polo, and you're writing a book about China for a European audience, what would you include in it? Would you include those things that are peculiar to China? I would. Chopsticks, for instance. Europeans do not eat with chopsticks. They do in China, yet chopsticks are not mentioned. Footbinding among elite Chinese women. Footbinding is a common tradition there. This process begins when the girl is an infant. The toes are turned under, heavily wrapped. The foot often is broken to create, by the time the girl reaches her sexual maturity, she doesn't really have a foot anymore. She has a little hoof. And this, of course, is a distinctive cultural marking. What it says, of course, is that this woman with bound feet, she is among the elite. She is a kept woman. She probably lives at court. She's probably wealthy. Let's face it, 99.9% of Chinese women have feet just like yours. But that small elite group who practice footbinding is quite different from the rest of the population. And these, of course, are the very people that Polo says he was hanging out with. Polo is not living with peasants and working in the rice paddies. He's living at court with the world's most powerful man, Kublai Khan. Among these women, presumably, who had bound feet. Yet, Polo doesn't mention this in his book. The historian, of course, also has to ask the question, why? Why is this a tradition in China? And there are a couple of reasons. One, the cultural marker of wealth and high status. But apparently footbinding or small feet are a sexual fetish in China. I admit this goes over my head, to each their own in this regard, but these bound feet strike me as an odd sexual fetish at the very least. But the important part is obviously that Polo doesn't mention it. Now, elite Chinese men quite often will grow their fingernails very long. And you've probably seen pictures of this. We'll provide images for you. This, again, is a cultural marker of elite status. And again, these are the very people that Polo is rubbing shoulders with. But he doesn't mention this either in his book. A common method of fishing in China, of course, is cormorant fishing. The cormorant is a river bird who dives into the water and catches fish. Cormorants have presumably been doing this for millennia. Chinese fishermen will tether one of the cormorant's legs to a pole, and then they'll take a pliable piece of metal, maybe something like pewter or brass, and tighten it around the cormorant's neck. Not enough to hurt the bird, but enough to keep him from swallowing the fish. And then the Chinese fisherman on his bamboo raft out in the river or the lake will cast the cormorant. The cormorant will dive into the water, catch the fish, bring it back to the fisherman. The metal here, the ring, keeps him from swallowing, so the fisherman simply removes the fish, puts it in his basket, and casts the cormorant again. This is a unique way of fishing, and we don't do this in the West. It's quite common in China, and presumably Polo saw it probably many times in his 17 years there, but he doesn't mention it. Chinese script looks nothing like the Western script. Polo doesn't talk about it. Maybe these things became commonplace to him. He didn't think they were interesting after all those years there. But remember, we're writing for a European audience. These are the very type of things that presumably a European audience would be interested to hear. Now, I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard it said there's one man-made object that you can see from orbit. Of course, the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall is just north of Beijing, a day or two ride by horseback. You can't miss it, yet Polo does not mention it. Again, strange, these cultural oddities of China that Polo skips. Now, of course, Chinese are the inventors of paper, and because of this, Chinese governments have tended to be large. If you give bureaucrats something to write on, they'll find things to write down. This is a boon for Chinese historians because you have very detailed records going back for millennia. And the various dynasties in China are well detailed in the archives. So if you want to investigate the Tang or the Sung or the Ming or the Wan dynasties, you can do so. It has records of wars and of famine and of uprisings and trade and various things. Yet in the archives of the Wan Dynasty, there's no mention of Marco Polo. There's no papal recognition of Polo's feat, nor is there any Venetian recognition. Of course, Venice is where he's from. This is interesting because in the next century, after Polo's book is published, a similar book is published. It's called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. Mandeville was an English knight. He traveled across North Africa, I believe, the Middle East, all the way to China. His book is very similar to Polo's. If you read Polo's book, you'd probably read Mandeville's as well. It's in the genre of travel literature, I suppose. We found out, I believe in the 19th century, that Sir John Mandeville and his travels were entirely fictitious, simply made up. Apparently a French priest who lived near a large library simply used materials from the library and cobbled up this fictitious adventurer and put it together in a book called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. It begs the question, doesn't it? If Mandeville is fictitious, or at least his travels, perhaps Polo's travels are exaggerated as well. Let me read a brief quote here, because it'll take us into our next lecture. Polo writes, quote, "The great Khan, Kublai Khan, begged that the Pope would send as many as 100 persons of our Christian faith, well qualified to enter into controversy, and able to clearly prove by force of argument to idolaters that the law of Christ was best, and that all other religions were false, and that if they would prove this, he and all under him would become Christians." Keep this in mind as we talk about Columbus's pitch in our next lecture. Let me end here by simply saying that, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that Columbus had 2 books on board his ship when he set sail to China in 1492, the Bible and Marco Polo's description of the world. It's interesting to think that Columbus may have been inspired by a book that may have been highly exaggerated. Nevertheless, it was an inspiration to him. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about the arguments that Columbus presented to try to get financial backing for his journey to China. Thank you very much.